today. Like I say, I'm Jessica Bradshaw from Channel 3. And what Scott and I are going to talk about is, and Liz, right at the beginning, you mentioned culture as your first box, and I'm always glad to see that. And when Phil was talking, he started by saying, we all do things differently now. Banking, really good example. And I have a background partly in the NHS and partly in the private sector. And I did work in retail banking for quite a long time, helping it shift its channels of access for customers. And what I find really interesting when I came to the NHS, that we all talk about all technology in the NHS, we're all digital now. Well, we're really not. And the thing is, my bank, so, how many people have got the app on their phone for the bank? Yeah, everybody, yeah. When was the last time you actually went into a bank? You just don't do it anymore. But when you press those buttons in there, do you assume that everybody at your bank understands that's how they receive that information and they don't have a choice about that, yeah? If you work for that bank and it comes through the app, you don't get to print it off, write it in your red book and put it in your drawer. That's not what you get to do. The rules are clear, yeah? Because if you felt somebody might be doing that, would you feel comfortable that that's how your financial transaction is being dealt with? Equally, when you put it in, do you assume someone prints it off and faxes it to another branch where somebody else inputs it into you and then sends it by post to somebody else? We assume they sorted that out before they issued the app. Is that right? And if you found out that that's not how it works, how comfortable would you feel? Not that good, would you? But in the NHS, that's what we do. The NHS is still the biggest purchaser of fax machines in Europe. And, and there is that thing, what is that? What's going on? And yet we want to be digital. The things Phil was saying, what we all want is a better experience for our patients, better clinical care delivery and outcomes, and a better experience for people who deliver that care. That has to, and yes, we want efficiency and we want all of those things, but in essence, that's what we want. But what we're doing is we're reaching for technology as an answer. And I often sit in front of boards who are saying to me, should we buy this shiny technology? Now, the suppliers in the room always hate me for this, but technology has no inherent value. I've got an iPhone, but if I don't choose to connect it to the internet, if I don't choose to use any apps on it, it's just a fancy landline that I can walk around with, because I haven't made the investment, I haven't decided to change my behaviour to get the benefits out of it. So I say to those boards, buy as much fancy technology as you like, but unless you do something to change the way you operate and the culture that you operate in, the technology will have no inherent value. And in fact, it'll potentially confuse both the people who work for you and the individuals who interact with you. And therefore, and it's like, I was saying to a board the other day, you want to buy a Ferrari, you think you've seen one, but can I remind you, you haven't learnt to drive and you haven't built a road and you don't know the highway code. So strangely, when you buy that, you're going to be really disappointed at the performance that you get from it, because it's not going to deliver its hype, is it? Because you're buying something that you're not ready for. And so the work that we do, we often get called into organisations where they say, we bought this technology and it doesn't work. Well, that's very rarely the case. We go and we say, well, the lights are flashing and it's on and it works. What hasn't happened is you didn't think about what you needed it for. So what we're here to talk about, and Scott is one of my clients, and is about, really some of the things, and all the people in this room, I know you have varying roles, but what I would say is if you're leaders in the NHS, whether it be in the technology sphere or more generally, whether you're suppliers, we need to start not from a technology first perspective. We need to start from a culture first perspective, and leadership is really key to that. Yeah. So, you press the button. Oh, you see, my helper had pressed the button, and I'm assuming that I'm manual here, but it's not. It's digitally doing its thing.
Just
so,
give me a kick every time, Jess, and I'll fix it.
So, and it is about, so bearing that in mind, technology itself is not the answer. It's about understanding the journey and the core objectives. No commercial organisation that I've ever worked with has bought technology without doing a significant amount of work on what the nature of its business model is going to be moving forward and the channels of access it's going to provide to its customers, because to do that is high risk and risks failure. And therefore, it is around, as leaders, we need to be really clear, what are the core objectives of digitising? And do we understand the difference between making the paper we've got electronic, which just means you can view it on a computer, and digitising, which means you can interact with it? So the things Phil are talking about is truly digital. That is about two-way interaction where people can transact with you as an organisation, as a care provider. And lots of organisations get that wrong. They think they've gone electronic and that's digital, but it's not the same thing. And so really think about what is the art of the possible and what's the broader view, but how are you going to make this transformational and not transactional? And the first thing is not to look at what technology you're going to buy, but it's to look at what you do now from a process point of view. How good are your processes? Actually, how do your customers, your patients, your service users, the citizen interact with you now? Because I can tell you one thing, if you've got a rubbish process and you digitise that, it'll just be worse than it was before. There's no two ways about that. It will just be worse. And it will break your organisation as well. Because the NHS is absolutely full of processes that only work because they've got multiple human nuance in them. You know, we go into organisations and they go, oh yes, well we don't do it quite like they do down the corridor, because I keep that note on my own spreadsheet on there, and I count the flimsies that come out of clinic, the pink ones, and I put those in that file. You know, and once you digitise that, well, you're in a lot of trouble, aren't you? Because all that human nuance has gone. So before you decide to digitise, put the technology aside and say, do we understand what we do in our organisation now? Do we understand how much? And digitisation thrives on consistency and on us all doing the same thing in the same way. Because the way you configure some kind of digital help, so you know when you say if the computer can do it for you, let it do it for you, but you've got to tell it what it's got to do, it won't make that up. But if you have to configure something in 50 different ways to do the same thing for one organisation, that's not helping anybody. So put the technology aside and stop and really look. How do you need to potentially transform your organisation, and what you do and how consistently you do it, allowing for clinical variance where it's required, but really think about that. And as leaders, own up to that's the task. Don't make it an IT project and then wonder why it didn't work. Really think about that, and then help the people who work for you who are going to be using this. You know, what we have in our lives, we all have a high level of technology acceptance. So we all use the banking app. But as you're doing that, are any of you muttering under your breath, who made me a bank clerk now? Why is this my job? Input is beneath me. Is that what you're doing? Or are you thinking, this drives my convenience, my ability to do this when I want, to do it in a way that I feel confident and effective with? Well, some of us might be going, oh, you know, why am I a travel agent as you're booking your holiday and it gets complicated? But mainly we're accepting of it. But when I go into health workplaces, the number of health staff I see banging keyboards in a crossway going, I'm not a data input clerk. No, you're not, but this is the way we live our lives now. So we've got to deal with our process and our ability to transform. But we've also got to help people understand it is no longer optional. This is the way we have to do things, and it's not about downgrading anybody's job. It's actually about making sure that we're keeping up with the world. You know, the world interacts with everything digitally. My last experience with the NHS, I've never been written to so many times. You know, nobody else writes to me, and I've got a drawer of letters from the NHS, mainly all telling me something contradictory within a week. But, you know, there is, as we all have. But, you know, it is around, we have no choice. If you imagine, we are already 10 years behind in digital channels of access from most major industries. If we leave it, if we don't pursue the things that Phil's talking about, and primary care is actually much further on than in secondary care, that, you know, the NHS will become impossible to deal with. You know, I'm nearly 50, but if I go on a website and have to ring somebody up, I feel cross already because it feels like too much of investment in my time. You know, people who are 20, you know, our kids, well, they can't even imagine doing that. So we really need to think, to keep it relevant, we're going to have to do something. So as leaders, we need to really understand the scale of the task and be resilient in the face of that challenge, because, you know, the NHS is full of multiple power centres who will all have a view. But in the end, we need to say, as an NHS, as individual organisations within it, we know you all have a view, but the given is this: we are going digital, and the behaviours that we display will have to fall in line with that, and we will support to make sure it's digital that works for you and works for patients, and we will train and we will support adoption, and we will make sure it's relevant and doesn't become a chore. But it is not optional anymore, and we've got to stand up to that message. And when it gets hard, we've got to say, no, we're still doing it. You know, the NHS is full of what I call half-built bridges of technology, none of which quite meet the other side of the river. You know, and we abandon so many, and the resource and the effort wasted in that is terrible. And we've got to just be clear, we are building that bridge, people. We're going. You know, and in the meantime, people who want it are just hurling themselves in the river trying to swim across, because, you know, we do have a very willing group, but let's make it easy for them, and let's make it clear what the path is for the people who are resistors. So it is around, you know, ask yourself, what's your digital maturity? How are you going to deal with that? You know, how do you move? and what is your preparedness for digitisation, and what human interventions are you going to have to negate, those kind of things. So really my message is, as leaders or influencers in this organisation, the technology is great and we should be talking about how innovative it is, but what we should constantly be challenging ourselves is, are we leading in the right way, and really understanding what it takes, and constantly making the statement saying, no, this is the path and there is no deviation from it, and we will work about how it's going to do. But if we deal with this from a technology-based perspective, it will fail, and we've seen that over and over again. Which leads me... yeah. So, sorry.
Yes.
And we'll just go to you. Right.
Yeah, so I think one of the things for me is that you really need to get your exec engaged. Yeah. So, and what I've found is that most executive boards tend to be passive when you're going to put in a large IT project as they see it. What actually you're doing is you're changing your entire business process. And you need some people with you who can really engage with that board and first of all make them listen. And I mean, you just heard Jess talk for 10 minutes there, and so you need some forces in nature who will be operating with your board and getting them to listen. You need to get them to understand that they need to become the experts. They can't passively allow other people to decide how their business is going to run. Yeah, because it's their business. They've got to make the decisions and they've got to understand the impact of those decisions that they're making. And I think, I mean, one of the things we did, Jess, with the design authority was actually to get the executive to be in a position where they were actually making the decisions about what changes we were going to make in the organisation, not a project manager down in a work stream within an EPR implementation. So it's really important to get them to the table. And now at Eastern North Hearts, it's the one meeting that I can assure that I'm going to get the medical director, the chief operating officer and the director of nursing is at our design authority meeting, because one, we're going to tell them what problems they've got, how we're going to, what the design is to get them out of that problem, and get them to agree that that's the way we can do it in a standard way across the organisation. It then leaves the senior managers and clinicians and clinical staff in a position where they can see that the board is truly bought into that change. And if they're going to say, well, actually, that won't work for me, they've then got the exec to convince. Yeah, and that takes quite a bit of commitment to do at that point. So I think you know, that exec engagement is something that you cannot do without. And over 80% of these programs fail, and I can guarantee you that the reason that they fail in the first instance is failure to get your chief exec to ensure that the rest of his exec are at the table, to get your chief operating officer to own every process in the organisation and take ownership of changes that will be made in there, to get your medical director to ensure that your clinicians turn up at the sessions that they need to turn up at, that get your medical director to ensure that you force the programme out into the organisation and not try to force the organisation into the programme. So one of the mechanisms that Channel 3 are using at the moment within Eastern North Hearts is what they call elbow to elbow. So what that means is that actually none of the clinicians or allied health professionals or nurses or administrators have to go to a room, a seminar room, to be talked at. What they actually do is go out into the organisation and sit by that operator, learning how it actually happens on the ground. And from there then building the mechanisms that will solve that. And that strict methodology and that strict kind of programmatical, you know, way of working is the thing that drives these programs forward. Now, I think that unless you get those board components right in the first place, you're going to be another statistic. You're going to be one of that 80% of programs that fail, really, regardless of the technology you can buy. The initial conversations I had with clinicians at Eastern North Hearts was they were telling me how horrible the software was. Yeah, but actually the program would have been in that state regardless of what software was bought. It was the way that the engagement was carried out in the first place. And the other big issue that we had, and Jess talked about it, actually saying if you've got a crap process, you know, you'll just accentuate it. The organisation didn't understand how poor it was at complying with process already. They'd built in a whole host of inherent workarounds that hid the fact that actually the previous technology systems that you're using are being really, really poorly complied with. And ultimately, so as stabilisation director at Eastern North Hearts, my job is to get us to a position where processes are complied with, that data is accurately inputted into the system, and that data can then be relied upon to make decisions. And actually, it's a really easy test at the end of it, saying, well, okay, if we've got a process for discharging the patient, what percentage of the time do we use that process to discharge the patient? Yeah, and you know, right now it's not high enough. You know, we need to be at 95, 98, 99%. But when it's 50%, you know, you've got a problem. You've got a problem for your organisation, and you've got a problem for your patients. Are you treating them safely? So, so I guess that's the learning so far. And I don't know, Jess, if you want to.
So I think our message, and I appreciate a brief and broad one, but is, you know, when we see the progress in GP-based, like primary care-based IT, that really is starting to provide the opportunity for patients and other service users or their carers to interact digitally. When we go back into, and we work with primary care as well, but when we go back into provider organisations, whether they be acute, community, mental health, whilst they talk the talk of that, actually the ability to really stop and think about how they might need to change in the way, and I appreciate they're more complex in some ways, but in the way GP behaviour has started to change, to really be true to the end goal of making digital access possible and wherever possible the default action. There is significant leadership challenge, and you know, you would hope that all organisations who, you know, have gone digital, you would hope that their board with one voice could say that was a deliberate strategic choice that we made. We understood the consequences of making it and the route to success. And right now, I would challenge a lot of provider organisations, secondary, acute, not so much GPs, if you went to their board, whether it be execs or non-execs, and said, can you tell me the point at which you made the deliberate strategic decision to start to move to digital maturity? Where are you on that maturity index? And do you understand the things that aren't about buying any technology, but are about how you run and lead your organisation? Do you understand the roadmap you've got to tread? And do you truly feel accountable for that? Or have you delegated it to a project team in the IT corner? Because if you have, it's not going to work. So in a way, it is around, that's very much our message, and very much what we go out and support organisations to do is, let's get truly strategic about digitisation, or we are going to continue to waste money, time and opportunity in having a go, and we need to have a serious go. So, and you know, and Scott has been, you know, he's a great client, because that is an organisation that asked us to go in to see why the system they bought didn't work, and we went in and said, sorry guys, it does, but it's the way you've done it that didn't work. And they have embraced that wholeheartedly, and the leadership team have stepped straight in, and I've said, you know, I've stood in front of chief exec medical, and I've gone, we know when I talk about doing this, I mean you, and they've taken that on board, and we are almost running the programme again, but the feel in the organisation is different, because the organisation has been prepared to say, sorry guys, we did a technology implementation and you all hate it, but we're sticking with the technology because it works, but this time we're going to do it with you in a collaborative way, and we're going to transform the organisation. And so stabilisation will be achieved, and then on to optimisation, which is when patients start to really feel the benefit. So, and in the end, that's what we all want. Okay, thanks.